The tropical sun beat down on the steel decks of USS New Orleans as she cut through the blue waters of the South Pacific on November 29, 1942. Lieutenant Commander Michael Reeves stood on the bridge wing, binoculars pressed to his eyes, scanning the horizon for any sign of Japanese aircraft. At 32 years old, he was the ship's damage control officer, responsible for keeping the heavy cruiser's watertight integrity intact during battle. It was a job that had become increasingly important as the war in the Pacific intensified. "Sir, message from the flagship," Ensign Bobby Chen called out from the radio room. "Task force to intercept enemy convoy off Guadalcanal tonight. We're to provide covering fire for destroyers conducting torpedo attacks." Reeves lowered his binoculars and exchanged glances with the officer of the deck, Lieutenant Jake Patterson. Both men knew what that meant. Another night action in the treacherous waters off Guadalcanal, where American and Japanese naval forces had been trading blows for months in a brutal campaign to control the strategic island. The waters there had been nicknamed Iron Bottom Sound for the number of ships that now rested on the seafloor. USS New Orleans was a veteran of this war. Built at the New York Navy Yard and commissioned in 1934, she was the lead ship of her class, 10,000 tons of steel, armed with 9 8-inch guns in 3 triple turrets, 8 5-inch anti-aircraft guns, and various smaller weapons. She had been at Pearl Harbor when the Japanese attacked on December 7, 1941, her crew manning their guns within 10 minutes, despite being in port with her engines under repair. She had fought at the Coral Sea in May, rescuing 580 survivors from the burning aircraft carrier Lexington. She had been at Midway, screening the carriers that had turned the tide of the Pacific War. But the grinding campaign for Guadalcanal was something different. This wasn't the grand carrier battles of earlier in the year. This was close-range, brutal surface combat in the darkness, ships firing at point-blank range, torpedoes crossing in the night, death coming suddenly and without warning. Below decks in turret number 1, gunner's mate First Class Frank Sullivan checked his equipment for the 3rd time that afternoon. At 24, Sullivan was from South Boston, a former dock worker who had joined the Navy in 1939 seeking adventure and steady pay. He had found both, though the adventure had proven more terrifying than he'd imagined. The turret was his domain, 3 massive 8-inch guns that could hurl 335-pound shells over 15 miles. His crew of 35 men loaded, aimed, and fired these weapons with practiced efficiency. "Think we'll see action tonight, Chief?" asked Seaman Jerry Hopkins, a 19-year-old kid from Iowa, who still looked like he should be in high school. "Count on it," Sullivan replied, running his hand along the breech of the nearest gun. "The Japs have been running supplies down to Guadalcanal every night. They call it the Tokyo Express. We call it the Rat Run. Either way, they're determined to keep their troops supplied, and we're determined to stop them." "How many times you been in a night action, Chief?" Sullivan thought about it. 3. Cape Esperance, that scrap off Savo Island, and another one I don't even remember the name of. Ships firing at each other so close you could see the enemy sailors on deck. It's nothing like daytime combat. Everything happens fast, you can't see clearly, there's confusion everywhere. You just load and fire, and pray the other guy's shells miss. In the ship's engineering spaces, deep in the bowels of the cruiser, Chief Machinist's mate Robert "Mac" MacDonald wiped sweat from his brow and checked the gauges on the massive turbines that drove New Orleans through the water. The engine rooms were always hot, but in the tropical Pacific they were unbearable, temperatures regularly exceeding 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Mac had been in the Navy for 16 years, a career man who knew these engines better than he knew his own family. "All systems nominal, Chief?" asked Fireman Second Class David Martinez, a 21-year-old from Texas who had been aboard for only 4 months. "Running smooth," Mac confirmed. These babies can push us to 32 knots if we need it. Let's hope we don't need it, but be ready for anything tonight." Martinez looked nervous. "Chief, is it true what they say about torpedoes? That if one hits the engine room—" "Don't think about it, kid," Max said firmly. "You do your job, follow procedures, and trust that the officers know what they're doing. That's all any of us can do." As evening fell, USS New Orleans took her position in the task force formation. Flagship Minneapolis led the column, followed by New Orleans, then cruisers Pensacola, Honolulu, and Northampton. 6 destroyers screened ahead and on the flanks. Rear Admiral Carlton Wright commanded from Minneapolis, planning to intercept a Japanese destroyer convoy reported heading for Guadalcanal. At 22:30 hours, the task force rounded Cape Esperance and headed into Iron Bottom Sound. The night was dark, with scattered clouds obscuring the moon. Visibility was poor, exactly the conditions the Japanese preferred for their nocturnal supply runs. On New Orleans's bridge, Captain Clifford Roper stood beside the helmsman, his hands clasped behind his back, projecting calm confidence for his crew even though his stomach was knotted with tension. Roper was 43, an Annapolis graduate who had spent his entire adult life in the Navy. He had commanded New Orleans for 8 months and had come to love the ship and her crew like family. "Radar contact," announced the radar operator. "Multiple targets, bearing 320, range 23,000 yards. "Sound general quarters," Roper ordered calmly. "All hands to battle stations." The alarm klaxon blared throughout the ship, and 1,100 men scrambled to their assigned positions. Watertight doors clanged shut, dividing the ship into isolated compartments. Gun crews loaded their weapons. Damage control parties stood ready with pumps, patches, and firefighting equipment. Lieutenant Commander Reeves took his position in central damage control, a cramped space filled with communications equipment and status boards showing the condition of every compartment in the ship. From here, he could coordinate response to any damage the ship might suffer. "All stations report manned and ready," reported the talker, a young sailor wearing a sound-powered phone headset that connected him to every compartment. In Turret 1, Frank Sullivan and his crew waited in tense silence. The turret was sealed, its hatches dogged down, making it a steel tomb that would either protect them or become their grave. The only connection to the outside world was the intercom and the firing instructions that would come from the ship's main battery director. At 23:16 hours, the Japanese were sighted visually, 8 destroyers in line ahead, moving at high speed down the Sound. Admiral Wright ordered his destroyers to attack with torpedoes while the cruisers provided covering fire. "Commence firing," Roper ordered. New Orleans' 9 8-inch guns roared to life, orange flames stabbing into the darkness. The shock of the guns firing shook the entire ship. Sullivan and his crew worked like machines, loading, firing, loading, firing. The turret filled with acrid smoke and the deafening concussion of the guns. The Japanese, caught by surprise, immediately fired back and launched torpedoes. Long lance torpedoes, the most advanced in the world, capable of 40-knot speeds and carrying massive warheads, began racing through the dark water toward the American ships. At 23:20 hours, Minneapolis, leading the column, was struck by 2 torpedoes. Massive explosions lit up the night, and the flagship began to slow, badly damaged. On New Orleans Bridge, Captain Roper saw Minneapolis's speed dropping and realized they were about to run into her stern. "Left full rudder! Emergency backing!" he shouted. The helmsman spun the wheel hard over, and New Orleans began to swing to port to avoid collision. But in doing so, she turned directly into the path of a long-lance torpedo that had missed Minneapolis. The torpedo struck New Orleans on the port bow at 2302 hours. The explosion was catastrophic beyond anything the crew had experienced. The torpedo's 1,000-pound warhead detonated the ship's forward magazines and aviation gasoline tanks. A massive secondary explosion followed, a fireball that shot hundreds of feet into the air, visible for miles. In central damage control, Reeves was thrown against a bulkhead as the ship lurched violently. The lights went out, plunging them into darkness illuminated only by emergency battle lanterns. Status boards lit up with red indicators. Reports began flooding in over the sound-powered phones. "Forward magazines exploded. Turret 1, no response. Turret 2, no response. Massive flooding, frames 10 through 45. Fire on the forecastle." But the worst report came moments later, from a lookout who could see what had happened from his position. "Sir, the bow is gone. The entire bow is gone." The torpedo explosion had severed the ship's bow 150 feet forward of turret number 2. Everything forward of that point, turret 1 with its 35-man crew, the forecastle, the anchor chains, the forward crew berthing spaces, had been blown completely off the ship. The severed bow section, still containing the weight of turret 1, had swung around the port side and punched several large holes in the hull before sinking. In turret 1, Frank Sullivan and all 34 of his crew died instantly, vaporized by the explosion, or drowned when the severed bow section sank. Jerry Hopkins, the 19-year-old from Iowa, never knew what hit him. Turret 2's crew also perished, killed by blast effects and flash burns when the explosion travelled through the ammunition passageways. In total, 183 men died in the initial explosion and immediate aftermath. On the bridge, Captain Roper stared in horror at what remained of his ship. Where the graceful bow had been, there was now just a gaping hole, jagged metal edges, and fire. The ship was wallowing, slowing to barely 2 knots, listing to port, burning fiercely forward. "Sir, request permission to abandon ship," said the executive officer, his voice shaking. Roper rounded on him. "Absolutely not. We're not abandoning this ship. She's still afloat, and we're going to keep her that way." He turned to Lieutenant Commander Reeves. "Michael, can we save her?" Reeves was already analysing the damage reports streaming in from throughout the ship. His mind raced through calculations. Flooding rates, remaining buoyancy, structural integrity. By every conventional measure, the ship should be sinking. The entire forward third of the vessel was gone. Water was pouring into the forward compartments. Fires raged where aviation gasoline had ignited. The list was increasing. But the torpedo had struck in one specific way that gave them a chance. The explosion had been so violent that it had essentially cauterized the wound, blowing the bow completely off, rather than leaving it attached and dragging the ship down. The bulkhead at frame 45, the new front of the ship, was holding, at least for now. "Sir, if we can shore up that forward bulkhead and control the flooding, we might make it," Reeves said. "But I need men forward, and I need them now. The conditions are—" "Get whoever you need," Roper interrupted. "Do whatever it takes." Reeves grabbed his damage control teams and headed forward into hell. The passageways leading toward the bow were filled with choking smoke and toxic fumes from burning fuel and materials. Water sloshed ankle-deep, then knee-deep as they moved forward. Bodies of sailors who had been caught by the blast lay in twisted heaps. There was no time to move them, no time for anything except saving the ship. They reached the forward bulkhead, a wall of steel that now formed the ship's new bow. It was buckling under the pressure of thousands of tons of seawater pushing against it. If it failed, New Orleans would sink in minutes. "Get the shoring timbers," Reeves shouted. "Brace that bulkhead." Lieutenant Richard Haynes and Ensign Andrew Foreman were already there, directing sailors to place heavy wooden beams against the bulkhead to reinforce it. The work was brutal and dangerous. The compartment was flooding, the fumes were overwhelming, and the bulkhead groaned and creaked ominously as it flexed inward. "We need to pump out this water," Haynes called out. "Get the portable pumps down here." But as crews ran to fetch pumps, another problem emerged. The severed bow section, with its heavy turret, hadn't sunk immediately. It had swung around the port side of the ship like a battering ram, punching several large holes in the hull before finally going under. Now water was flooding in from multiple locations. "Sir, we've got breaches on the port side, frames 30 through 40, reported a damage controlman, his face blackened by smoke. Reeves made a split-second decision. "Foreman, take a team and patch those holes. Haynes, stay here and keep that bulkhead braced. I'm going to try to establish counterflooding on the starboard side to correct the list." The three officers split up, each heading into the most dangerous areas of the damaged ship. The conditions were nightmarish. Toxic fumes from burning materials filled the air. The ship was listing 10 degrees to port and increasing. Water continued to pour in through multiple breaches. Electrical fires sparked and flared in damaged systems. Ensign Foreman led his team to the port side breaches, wading through chest-deep water. They worked by flashlight, trying to patch holes while Japanese ships still fired in the distance, and the possibility of another torpedo strike remained. Foreman was 23 years old, from a small town in Ohio, barely a year out of the Naval Academy. But he worked with calm efficiency, directing his men to place collision mats and wooden plugs over the holes, anything to slow the flooding. Lieutenant Haynes remained at the forward bulkhead, supervising as sailors placed timber after timber against the buckling steel. The bulkhead was never designed to be the bow of a ship, never designed to withstand the full force of the ocean pressing against it. But with enough bracing, enough shoring, it might hold. Reeves coordinated everything from central damage control, making decisions about which compartments to flood intentionally to correct the list, which pumps to prioritize, which fires to fight first. It was an impossible juggling act, prioritizing one crisis while another spiraled out of control. At 0100 hours, Lieutenant Commander Hubert Hayter, who had taken over direct damage control efforts in the forward section when Reeves moved to central control, radioed back with grim news. "Sir, the fumes forward are becoming unbearable. Carbon monoxide and gasoline vapors. We need respirators." "Negative. We don't have enough," Reeves replied. "Can you complete the shoring?" "Working on it, sir. But it's getting hard to breathe. Do what you can, then get your men out." "Understood." But Hayter didn't order his men out. He stayed at his post, directing the final bracing of the bulkhead, even as the toxic fumes grew thicker. He knew that if he left, if he pulled his men before the work was complete, the bulkhead might fail and the ship would sink. So he stayed, breathing the poisonous air, growing weaker with each minute. Lieutenant Haynes and Ensign Foreman faced the same decision. The fumes in their areas were just as deadly. They could leave, save themselves, or they could stay and finish the work that might save the ship. They stayed. By 0130 hours, the immediate crisis had passed. The forward bulkhead was holding, braced by dozens of timbers wedged into place. The port side breaches had been patched sufficiently to slow the flooding. Pumps were gaining on the water level. The fires were under control. New Orleans was still afloat. But when damage control parties finally evacuated the forward compartments due to the toxic atmosphere, they found Lieutenant Commander Hayter, Lieutenant Haynes, and Ensign Foreman unconscious, overcome by carbon monoxide and gasoline vapors. All three men were rushed to the ship's medical station, but it was too late. They had stayed at their posts too long, breathed too much poison. All three died within the hour. Captain Roper stood beside their bodies in the sick bay, his jaw tight with grief and rage. These men had saved his ship, had sacrificed their lives so that New Orleans could survive. Hayter was 34, married with 2 children. Haynes was 26, engaged to be married. Foreman was 23, his whole life ahead of him. "They died heroes," the ship's chaplain, Howell Forgy, said quietly. "By their sacrifice, 900 men live." "That doesn't make it easier," Roper said. "No, but it makes it meaningful." As dawn broke on November 30th, the full scale of the disaster became clear. New Orleans's entire bow, 150 feet of the ship, was gone. Where once there had been a graceful, knife-like prow cutting through the water, there was now just a flat, jagged edge of torn metal barely above the waterline. The ship looked impossibly damaged, like it had been bitten in half by a giant shark. The rest of the task force had fared little better. Minneapolis had lost her bow too, though not as catastrophically. Pensacola had taken a torpedo that wrecked her engineering spaces. Northampton had been hit multiple times and was sinking despite desperate efforts to save her. Only Honolulu had escaped serious damage. The Battle of Tassafaronga, as it would become known, was a devastating tactical defeat. The Japanese destroyer convoy had escaped relatively unscathed while inflicting terrible losses on the American cruisers. It was a humiliating reminder that despite American successes earlier in the year, the Japanese still possessed superior night-fighting capabilities and weapons. But New Orleans was afloat, and Captain Roper intended to keep her that way. "Helm, what's our steering capability?" he asked. "Minimal, sir. We can barely maneuver, and we're making less than 2 knots. Engineering, can we increase speed?" Mac MacDonald's voice came back over the intercom from the engine room. "Negative, sir. If we push the engines harder, we'll tear that forward bulkhead apart. We're lucky to be making any speed at all." Roper studied the chart. They were 80 miles from Tulagi Harbour, where the US had a small repair facility. At 2 knots, that was a 40-hour journey through waters still crawling with Japanese submarines and subject to daily air attacks. "Set course for Tulagi, best possible speed," Roper ordered, "and pray we make it." The journey to Tulagi took 36 agonizing hours. New Orleans wallowed through the water like a dying whale, barely under control, vulnerable to any attack. Japanese reconnaissance aircraft spotted them and radioed their position, but by pure luck, or divine intervention, as Chaplain Forgy believed, no submarines or bombers found them before they reached the relative safety of Tulagi Harbour. They arrived on December 1st, 1942, and immediately set about camouflaging the ship. Palm fronds and branches were draped over the decks and superstructure to hide New Orleans from aerial observation. The ship was moved close to the shoreline and anchored, her remaining guns ready to contribute to the island's anti-aircraft defences. But they couldn't stay at Tulagi. The harbour had minimal repair facilities, certainly nothing capable of fixing damage this extensive. New Orleans needed a major shipyard, preferably in the United States. The nearest adequate facility was Pearl Harbor, 3,000 miles away. But Pearl Harbor's dry docks were full, repairing other battle-damaged ships. The next option was Sydney, Australia, 1,800 miles to the southwest. But could New Orleans make that journey? Could a ship with no bow survive 1,800 miles of open ocean? "We need to build a temporary bow," Lieutenant Commander Reeves said during a meeting of the ship's officers. "Something to give us a reasonable profile, reduce water resistance, and keep the sea from pouring into the forward compartments every time we hit a wave." "Build a bow out of what?" someone asked. "We don't have steel plating. We don't have welding equipment capable of that kind of work." Reeves looked out at the tropical jungle surrounding Tulagi. "Coconut logs," he said. "We build a false bow out of coconut logs." There was a moment of stunned silence. Then someone laughed, not from amusement, but from the sheer audacity of the idea. "You want to repair a 10,000-ton cruiser with coconut trees?" the gunnery officer asked. "I want to give us a fighting chance of reaching Australia," Reeves replied. "The logs won't restore our streamlining, but they'll create a barrier against the sea. We cover them with canvas, seal everything we can, and hope it holds." Over the next 11 days, the crew of New Orleans became lumberjacks and carpenters. Working parties went ashore and cut down dozens of coconut palms, trimming them into logs of roughly uniform size. These were lashed together with chains and steel cable, creating a rough approximation of a bow. The improvised structure was secured to the ship's damaged forward section, covered with layers of canvas, and sealed with tar and whatever waterproofing materials could be scavenged. It looked absurd, ridiculous, like something from a comic book rather than real naval engineering. But it was all they had. "This will never work," more than one sailor muttered. "It'll work because it has to," Reeves replied. The bigger problem was how to make the journey. New Orleans's damaged forward section couldn't handle the stress of pushing through the water bow first. The coconut log structure might hold for a few hours, maybe a day, but over 100 miles it would disintegrate. "We'll sail stern first," Captain Roper announced. Again, stunned silence. "Sir, you mean backwards?" the navigator asked. "Precisely. We'll back out of Tulagi and maintain reverse course all the way to Sydney. The stern is undamaged and hydrodynamically designed to move through water. The coconut bow is just there to keep seawater from flooding the forward compartments. We'll navigate using the stern as our leading edge." It was unprecedented. No one had ever sailed a major warship backwards across 100 miles of ocean, but no one had ever lost the forward third of a heavy cruiser and survived either. New Orleans was writing her own rules. On December 12, 1942, USS New Orleans backed out of Tulagi Harbour and began her improbable journey to Australia. The ship moved at a maximum speed of 8 knots. Any faster, and the strain on the damaged forward section became dangerous. She sailed stern first through waters that might contain Japanese submarines. She sailed past islands that might harbour enemy aircraft. She sailed with 900 surviving crew members who had already cheated death once and were now asking fate for a second miracle. In the engine rooms, Mac MacDonald and his crew worked around the clock, keeping the turbines running smoothly in reverse for days on end. The engines weren't designed for this kind of continuous operation in reverse, but they held together through a combination of careful maintenance and sheer willpower. On the bridge, navigators plotted course corrections while steering a ship backwards by reference points at the stern rather than the bow. It was like trying to parallel park for 100 miles. Throughout the ship, damage control parties remained on constant alert. The coconut bow leaked, requiring continuous pumping. The forward bulkhead, stressed by 11 days at Tulagi, developed new cracks that had to be patched. Every wave, every swell, threatened to tear apart the repairs that barely held, and every man aboard wondered if they would make it, if this absurd gambit would succeed, or if they would join so many other ships in Iron Bottom Sound. The journey took 12 days of nerve-wracking vigilance. On December 24, 1942, Christmas Eve, USS New Orleans backed into Sydney Harbour, stern first, with her jury-rigged coconut bow still mostly intact. Thousands of Australians lined the harbour to watch, many weeping at the sight of this battered, broken ship that had refused to sink. Newsreel cameras captured the moment for posterity. The heavy cruiser with 1/3 of her length missing, coconut logs where her bow should be, sailing backwards into port, battle flags still flying, her crew standing at attention on deck despite their exhaustion. It was one of the most remarkable feats of seamanship and damage control in naval history. A ship that should have sunk had sailed 100 miles backwards to safety. The crew that refused to give up had brought her home. As New Orleans tied up at the pier, Captain Roper addressed his crew over the ship's intercom. "Men of the New Orleans," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "we've accomplished something extraordinary. We've saved our ship against impossible odds. We've lost shipmates, good men who sacrificed everything so that we could survive. Lieutenant Commander Hayter, Lieutenant Haynes, Ensign Foreman, and 180 others gave their lives. We honor them by completing what they started. This ship will be repaired. This ship will return to the fight. And this ship will carry the memory of every man who died aboard her into every battle we fight from this day forward. Well done, sailors. Well done." The repairs at Sydney took 3 months. Australian shipwrights worked around the clock to construct a temporary stub bow that would allow New Orleans to make the long journey to Puget Sound Navy Yard in the United States. The coconut log bow was removed, and in its place a steel structure was welded, not pretty, not streamlined, but seaworthy enough for the 7,000-mile voyage to America. On March 7, 1943, USS New Orleans arrived at Puget Sound, where she would undergo complete reconstruction. The work took 7 months. A brand new bow was fabricated and attached, matching the original design. All damaged systems were repaired or replaced. The ship was modernized with improved radar, additional anti-aircraft weapons, and upgraded fire control systems. But the most important work happened in the crew's quarters, where the names of the 183 men killed at Tassafaronga were inscribed on a memorial plaque. Lieutenant Commander Hubert Hayter, Lieutenant Richard Haynes, and Ensign Andrew Foreman each received posthumous Navy crosses for their heroism. The citation for Hayter's award read, "For extraordinary heroism and distinguished service," who remained at his station directing damage control efforts despite lethal concentrations of toxic fumes, ultimately giving his life so that his ship and crew might survive. Lieutenant Commander Michael Reeves was promoted to commander and awarded the Navy Cross for his damage control leadership. He would remain with New Orleans throughout the war, training new damage control officers in the lessons learned from that terrible night. Captain Clifford Roper received the Distinguished Service Medal. When asked about that night, he always deflected credit to his crew. "I just gave orders," he would say. "They did the impossible." Mac MacDonald, the chief machinist's mate, who kept the engines running during the backwards voyage to Sydney, was awarded the Silver Star. He too stayed with the ship, becoming something of a legend among the engineering crew. "If Mac says the engines can do it, they can do it," became a common saying aboard New Orleans. On August 31, 1943, USS New Orleans departed Puget Sound, fully repaired and ready to return to war. She looked like new, but she wasn't the same ship. She carried scars visible and invisible, memories of the night she should have died, determination born from survival against impossible odds. The crew that sailed her back to the Pacific was a mix of original survivors and new sailors who had heard the legend and were honored to serve aboard the ship that refused to sink. Among the new crew members was Seaman Robert Chen, younger brother of Ensign Bobby Chen, who had survived Tassafaronga. Bobby had been transferred to another ship, but his brother volunteered specifically for New Orleans. "My brother told me this ship takes care of her crew," Robert said when asked why he'd chosen New Orleans. "That if you do your job, if you fight for her, she'll bring you home." New Orleans rejoined the fleet in time for the Central Pacific Offensive. She fought at the Gilbert Islands, bombarding Tarawa in November 1943. She participated in the Marshall Islands campaign, her 8-inch guns pulverizing Japanese fortifications at Kwajalein. She screened carriers during the massive air raids on Truk in February 1944, And at every battle, when the order came to go to general quarters, when the crew ran to their battle stations and sealed the watertight doors, they thought about the men who had died saving this ship. They thought about Hayter, Haines and Foreman staying at their posts even as poisonous fumes overcame them. They thought about the 180 others who had perished in the initial explosion, and they fought not just for victory, but to honor those sacrifices. In June 1944, New Orleans participated in the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the largest carrier battle of the Pacific War. American fighter pilots decimated Japanese air attacks in what became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, but the Japanese still managed to launch several attacks that penetrated the defensive screen. New Orleans's anti-aircraft batteries shot down 3 enemy aircraft, her gunners working with the precision and determination that had become the ship's trademark. In October 1944, New Orleans was part of the force that invaded the Philippines, returning to liberate islands the Japanese had captured in 1941-42. She bombarded Leyte Gulf, providing fire support for the troops going ashore. During the Battle of Surigao Strait, she helped destroy Japanese battleships and cruisers in one of the last traditional naval gun battles in history. Commander Reeves, still serving as damage control officer, stood at his station during that battle and marveled at the full circle they'd completed. 2 years ago, New Orleans had been a shattered wreck, sailing backwards to safety with a bow made of coconut logs. Now she was helping to destroy the Japanese Navy that had nearly destroyed her. Throughout 1945, as the war ground toward its conclusion, New Orleans continued to serve. She bombarded Iwo Jima in February, her shells helping to prepare the way for the Marine invasion. She was at Okinawa in April and May, enduring kamikaze attacks, her anti-aircraft guns firing constantly to defend against suicide aircraft. Several kamikazes targeted her, recognizing the cruiser as a high-value target, but none hit. Whether it was skill, luck, or the guardian spirits of the men who had died to save her, New Orleans survived. On August 15, 1945, when Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender, USS New Orleans was anchored in Tokyo Bay as part of the occupation force. She had survived the entire war, fighting in every major campaign from Pearl Harbor to Japan's surrender. She had earned 17 battle stars, more than almost any other cruiser in the Navy. At a ceremony on the ship's deck, Captain Roper, now Admiral Roper having been promoted, addressed the crew one final time before relinquishing command. "This ship should have sunk on November 30th, 1942, he said, his voice carrying across the silent deck. By every calculation, every rule of naval architecture, every reasonable expectation, she should rest on the bottom of Iron Bottom Sound with so many others. But she didn't sink. She refused to die, not because of her steel or her design, but because of her crew. 183 men gave their lives that night. Hundreds more risked theirs to save her. And in the years since, every man who has served aboard this ship has carried forward that spirit of sacrifice and determination. You have honored those who died by fighting brilliantly, by bringing this ship through every battle, by refusing to accept defeat even when defeat seemed certain. I am proud to have commanded you. I am honored to have served with you, and I know that every man who died saving this ship is proud of what you've accomplished in their names." USS New Orleans was decommissioned in 1947, part of the massive post-war reduction of the Navy. She was sold for scrap in 1957, cut apart and melted down, her steel recycled into new products. But before she was scrapped, the memorial plaque with the names of the 183 men who died at Tassafaronga was removed and placed at the Naval Academy in Annapolis, where it remains to this day. Commander Michael Reeves retired from the Navy in 1958 as a Rear Admiral, having served as head of the Navy's Damage Control School for 10 years after the war. He trained thousands of sailors in the techniques that had saved New Orleans, ensuring that other ships and crews would benefit from the lessons learned that terrible night. Mac MacDonald stayed in the Navy until 1960, retiring as a Master Chief Petty Officer. He became an instructor at the Navy's engineering school, teaching young machinists about engines, but more importantly, about dedication and refusing to give up even when situations seemed hopeless. The survivors of USS New Orleans held reunions every year, gathering to remember their fallen shipmates and celebrate their improbable survival. As the years passed and age thinned their ranks, the gatherings grew smaller, but the bonds forged in that crucible never weakened. In 2012, at what would be the final reunion, only 12 survivors remained. They gathered in New Orleans, Louisiana, the city their ship had been named for, and placed a wreath in the Mississippi River in memory of their shipmates. "We were just doing our jobs," said one survivor, now in his 90s. "We didn't think about being heroes. We just knew we had to save the ship." "But you did save her," a historian interviewing them replied. "Against impossible odds, you saved her and brought her home." "No," the old sailor said, shaking his head. "Hayter saved her. Haynes saved her. Foreman saved her. They gave their lives. We just did what they would have wanted. We kept fighting." In July 2024, a remarkable discovery was made. A team of underwater researchers using remotely operated vehicles in Iron Bottom Sound located a large section of wreckage at a depth of 675 meters. As they examined it with cameras, they found distinctive features: anchor chains, gun turret foundations, structural elements that matched only one ship. They had found the bow of USS New Orleans, severed 82 years earlier by a Japanese torpedo, resting on the seafloor where it had sunk. The wreckage included the remains of turret number 1, where Frank Sullivan and his 34 crew members had died instantly when the torpedo exploded. The discovery made international news. Survivors' families travelled to the Solomon Islands to pay respects. The Navy conducted a memorial ceremony, recognizing the site as a war grave. Divers placed a memorial plaque on the wreckage, listing the names of those who had died there. "Finding this wreckage connects us to history in a profound way," said retired Rear Admiral Samuel Cox, Director of Naval History and Heritage Command. USS New Orleans is the story of heroism, sacrifice, and the indomitable will to survive. These men faced the worst circumstances imaginable and refused to give up. That's the spirit that won the Pacific War. The story of USS New Orleans, the cruiser that lost 1/3 of her length, sailed 1,800 miles backwards with a bow made of coconut logs, and returned to fight for 3 more years, became one of the most remarkable survival stories in naval history. It demonstrated that ships don't survive battles solely because of their armor or weapons or design. They survive because of their crews, because of men willing to sacrifice everything, because of determination that refuses to accept the impossible. Today, the memorial plaque at Annapolis bears 183 names. Students at the Naval Academy pass it regularly, many not knowing its story. But those who stop to read the inscription learn about a night when a ship should have died, about officers who stayed at their posts until poisonous fumes killed them, about a crew that refused to abandon their vessel, about coconut logs and backwards voyages, and the fundamental truth that courage and determination can overcome any obstacle. The inscription on the plaque reads simply, USS New Orleans, CA-32, Battle of Tassafaronga, November 30th, 1942. In memory of 183 officers and men who gave their lives so that their ship and shipmates might survive. Their sacrifice saved this vessel and enabled her to fight with honor throughout the Pacific War. They shall not be forgotten. And they haven't been. Every ship faces moments of crisis, moments when survival seems impossible, moments when the easy choice is to give up. In those moments, sailors remember USS New Orleans. They remember that a ship with no bow sailed 1,800 miles to safety. They remember that 3 officers died at their posts to save their crew. They remember that impossible is just another word for difficult. That is the legacy of the cruiser that refused to sink. Not just a story of one ship in one battle, but a testament to the human spirit's capacity to endure, to fight, to survive against any odds. It's a reminder that heroism isn't always dramatic charges into battle or last stands against overwhelming forces. Sometimes heroism is staying at your post in a flooded compartment full of poisonous gas. Sometimes it's keeping engines running for 12 days in reverse. Sometimes it's simply refusing to give up when everyone tells you the situation is hopeless. USS New Orleans proved that ships are more than steel and weapons. They're the men who crew them, the sacrifices they make, the determination they embody. And sometimes, when the crew refuses to let their ship die, the ship becomes immortal, not in physical form, but in memory, in inspiration, in the lessons taught to generations that follow. The cruiser that refused to sink lives on, not in scrapyards or museums, but in the hearts of all who learn her story and resolve to face their own impossible challenges, with the same courage her crew displayed on that dark night in Iron Bottom Sound, when death came calling and was turned away by men who simply refused to quit.